USPAP Page 60. Mode Standard 10. The appraiser must provide sufficient information to enable the client and intended users to understand the rationale for the opinions and conclusions, including reconciliation in accordance with Standards Rule 9-5. X. Clearly and conspicuously state all extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions, and state that their use might have affected the assignment results, and include assigned certification in accordance with Standards Rule 10-3. B. The content of a restricted appraisal report must be consistent with the intended use of the appraisal and, at a minimum, state the identity of the client, unless the client has specifically requested otherwise. 102. And state a prominent use restriction that limits use of the report to the client and warns that the rationale for how the appraiser arrived at the opinions and conclusions set forth in the report may not be understood properly without additional information in the appraiser's work file. Comment. An appraiser must use care when identifying the client to avoid violations of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule. If a client requests that the client's identity be withheld from the report, the appraiser may comply with this request. In these instances, the appraiser must document the identity of the client in the work file and must state in the report that the identity of the client has been withheld at the client's request. The restricted appraisal report is for client use only. Before entering into an agreement, the appraiser should establish with the client the situations where this type of report is to be used and should ensure that the client understands the restricted utility of the restricted appraisal report. State the intended use of the appraisal. 03. Comment. The intended use of the appraisal must be consistent with the limitation on use of the restricted appraisal report option in this standards rule, i.e. client use only. State information sufficient to identify the business or intangible asset and the interest appraised. Comment. The identification information must include property characteristics relevant to the type and definition of value and intended use of the appraisal. State the extent to which the interest appraised contains elements of ownership control, including EIV, the basis for that determination. State the extent to which the interest appraised lacks elements of marketability and/or liquidity, v. 3. including the basis for that determination. V. State the standard, type of value and the premise of value, and cite the source of its definition. V. State the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. Comment. The effective date of the appraisal establishes the context for the value opinion, while the date of the report indicates whether the perspective of the appraiser on the market or property as of the effective date of the appraisal was prospective, current, or retrospective. V. State the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. 104. Advisory Opinion 36. Identification and disclosure of client, intended use, and intended users. Advisory Opinion 36. Identification and disclosure of client, intended use, and intended users. Advisory Opinion 28. Scope of work decision, performance, and disclosure and Advisory Opinion 29. An acceptable scope of work. USPAP 2018-20 on the Appraisal Foundation.